Everywhere you turn, someone's either hyping up artificial intelligence or panicking about it. And I know because at a certain point I panicked about it too. But if you're a lifelong learner, I think you'll appreciate where I've arrived at. Because I think that the real threat isn't the technology. It's about what people are doing to your thinking in terms of how they influence it. And so it's not really that AI can wreck your thinking, but we can certainly react negatively to the thinking of others. So in this video, I'm going to show you how you can use AI as a lifelong learner without losing your mind or your ability to think for yourself. And part of this skill has to do with something that I think is going to surprise you. Some of the most intimately involved innovators agree with me that it still makes sense to use a notebook and a pen or just colored pens to drag a lot of words in different colors across very, very large pieces of paper to create old school ideas and old school mind maps. It's not nostalgia. It's common sense, and it's also a survival strategy. Now, I'm not going to bore you with some paranoid conspiracy and suggest that the moment you stop writing by hand in a journal, you're starting to let machines dictate how you think. But there is a relationship between the medium you use to assist your thinking, what you think about, and how you think about the things that you think about. And I believe it's beyond obvious that many people mistake how fast they consume information as a form of accomplishment, when far too often it's really just busy work and it's little more than activity. Please stop mistaking activity for accomplishment, because this problem isn't new. It's not a sign of the information age or the artificial intelligence age. Speed reading gurus have duped people for years with the fantasy that speed is some kind of substance. And the few good ideas you might find in a speed reading book or a course, well, those ideas tend to be borrowed from somewhere else. Priming books, for example, beautiful technique. Roland Barthes, Gerard Genet, other people, they talked about such tactics decades before mass market books sadly watered those strategies down. These days, the whole speed reading field is mostly redundant anyhow. And the slow reading I've been preaching since I was a professor at traditional universities and in my Read with Momentum online program, well, slow reading is really, really important, more important than ever before. Because now, not only can you just ask an AI to give you a summary, but sometimes it actually makes sense to do so. Now, what those circumstances might be for you, well, we can talk about that, and we may in a moment, but the balance I want to help you strike today is with some book recommendations I think that you'll find well worth reading, and some of them you probably have never heard of before. And I think they're going to be enjoyable and educating because, in my view, the best way to protect your lifelong learning goals isn't to run away from AI. Artificial intelligence doesn't even really mean anything. It's a vague buzzword we throw around like automobile or vehicle, neither of which help us drill down into categories like pickup truck versus luxury Porsche. And the more you and I let that kind of vague generalization about the AI happen, the further you and I drift from the kind of knowledge that built civilizations in the first place. Now again, at first, I myself was scared, specifically of some of the things I was seeing with ChatGPT and other chatbots that generate so much text so quickly, and in many cases, better than I can. But when you take your time to ground your mind and your thinking in physical tools about what's happening, interacting with the tools to enable yourself to see what's going on in context, Well, everything changes, and I was very, very excited to see some of the biggest AI innovators doing this themselves. So you can help yourself avoid cliches. And some of the worst cliches are these tired old binaries, human versus machine. And you know, that distinction was never nearly as distinct as some of us like to think. Now, before I get to some of the books that I want to recommend that you read, or at least make you aware of, I strongly suggest that if you aren't already doing it, get in the habit of taking physical notes, including from this video. Whether it's in the form of a dedicated notebook or you're using index cards, I often use index cards myself. They're very, very powerful. And not only that, but I don't have to use index cards exclusively. I sometimes have index cards in my notebooks, and often I don't even use words on my index cards. I just have little drawings that I make that help prompt me to solve the puzzle. So I'm like, what was I talking about here? And then, this whole little drawing is itself a wonderful way to learn, because it prompts me to solve a little bit of a puzzle, maybe prompting in the AI sense that I have to generate an answer. Anyway, here's the situation. We're living in a strange paradox. Various AIs can now summarize any book you feed into them, and they can do it in all kinds of flavors, depending on their training, and they can even hallucinate things, like if you say, hey, tell me how Elvis would summarize this book. You'd be surprised, and it's, in a way, kind of creative, right? But very few people in this paradox can remember what they themselves read last week. Some people can't even remember what they read an hour ago. And then if you're using some of these tools like ChatGPT, you may not even be able to keep up with the amount of material you're having it produce to even form any memory that you could possibly forget. So yes, it's old-fashioned, but we have oodles of research that show a hand-memory connection. Lynn Kelly, one of the most respected memory experts alive, considers writing the ultimate encryption device, not to mention the use of physical objects for memory at large. So she talks a lot in some of her books about the Lucasa. So if you haven't read the memory code, get into that. Now, for myself, I take more notes now than ever before, and I've enjoyed multiple rewards as a result. And to prove just how important note-taking is, let me introduce you to Andrew Maine. If you've been interested in magical performance, then you may know the name, or you may have read some of his books like The Naturalist, which I find really, really interesting, and you may have heard him on the Magnetic Memory Method podcast before. I find his work really interesting for a couple of reasons. So he has a podcast that I only recently learned about with some co-hosts called Weird Things. And he was talking about how important memory training and using physical notebooks is to him. And yes, he mentions me in this episode, so thank you for that. But the episode is called Robots, AI, and the Future of Work, a deep dive. And in this episode, Andrew also talks about various angles on robotics and how important human connections still remain to him, even though he is deep into the AI. And just to give you a sense of how deep he is into it, he's the host of the OpenAI podcast. So that should give you some indication. But there's something else that I noticed about Andrew that I'll point out. But first of all, let me say a couple of things about The Naturalist, because I really have been enjoying the ideas that come out of it. It's an interesting meditation on the nature of the physical world, new technologies, and the role of expertise, how those things combine. So the tactile world is everywhere in the book, and you can see the choice of the cover, which evokes bear fur, is all about tactility, and it's just a kind of a neat book to look at, actually, because of that choice. And in this book, Maine manages to expertly convey multiple levels of the raw sensory foundation of what it means to be an expert, but an expert in a changing world where there's a changing of the guard. The old school people are sort of against the new school people, and you get a sense of the thinking that has to take place, the role of observation as a very specific mental discipline and cognitive mapping, computational thinking, and essentially you're reading about the human training of perception itself in real time with recall from the past and thinking about the future. And it's the mind's ability to track multiple data points while other people are deliberately ignoring them or holding on to a world that doesn't exist anymore. So in order to think clearly and solve problems in this immediate world, well, I think what Andrew is saying in some of his most recent podcasts and in this book is that there are things that AI and technology can never replace. The muscle of your thinking. And although, the naturalist here is not really about AI as such, I mention it because it is about computational thinking. And it's about how humans have done this for a very, very long time and how that some people prey on you for doing it. And it's just a wonderful study of our collaboration with technologies and how there's not really necessarily a clear border between the human and our tools. There never was, and there may never be. So one of my favorite parts of the book is a quote which says, "Our war on cancer has been filled with countless maybes. Billions of dollars and millions of human hours have been spent chasing after a pattern we can't even begin to guess at. Even still, we've made some progress. Many of these maybes have panned out. People live longer than before because not all that effort was wasted. And for every maybe that turns out to be a no, we still move forward." Now, please don't mistake this for romanticism. It's cognitive realism. Our brains evolved to think through contact with the world. Now, digital tools can extend that process, but I think we make a mistake when we divide the digital from the material. And it allows our fears of technology to replace our common sense. Our comprehension actually collapses because I think what Maine does is reminds us that the digital is not spirit. It's really just as physical as anything else, or at least it's produced out of a material substrate of electricity, chips, silicon, carbon, and other elements that interact with the chemical baths of our squishy, meaty brains. So even if we don't know all the rules that constrain our perception of reality, it's clear that rules do exist. And speaking of rules, or perhaps better said, laws, the second book I recommend you check out is called The Proving Ground by Michael Connelly. Now, I suppose Connelly is best known for his crime fiction, but I think I'm a bigger fan of his legal thrillers. And Connelly has done something subtle and interesting with AI in this one. Now, it might seem on the surface kind of like a negative about AI, but I don't think so. I mean, The Proving Ground is a very interesting title here. And Connelly's built a courtroom narrative where it's not AI that's on trial per se, but how truth has been shifted or changed, our perspective on it. And that's what's on trial. And in the story, data gets forged. Evidence gets erased in some cases, and reality itself gets imitated, messing with the procedural mechanics that both the legal thriller and crime novel rely upon. So it's not just about how this is happening in the real world, but it's about how the fictional worlds of the procedural legal thriller, crime genre novel have to change in order to keep up with the change in the world. It's like the nature of proof becomes entirely psychological in a way that it never was before. And the entire time I keep thinking, I wonder how Michael Connelly might have used AI in this, if at all. And then I corrected myself a little bit because I used Michael Connelly myself in a way to program myself. But I'll get into that in a second. But another reason I think of Connelly as being super interesting and valuable for lifelong learners is that pretty much every novel that I've read is an exercise in thinking deeply about what humanity really is. And Connelly's built this entire universe around characters like Mickey Haller, and whether or not Mickey Haller has a relationship to Harry Haller in Hermann Hesse's Steppenwolf or not. Steppenwolf, I guess, better said. I don't know, but this is just a whole world around this guy. But this also involves another character named Hieronymus Bosch. And so many of Michael Connelly's books are based on this detective named Hieronymus Bosch. And this is an allusion to a painter of astonishing works like The Garden of Earthly Delights, and I think it's called The Last Judgment. This is a fairly highbrow reference in so-called popular fiction, and there's lots of references to jazz and really interesting art beyond Bosch. But my point is that Connolly's productivity is hardly the antithesis of algorithmic creativity. It's referential. He's referring to how he wanted to make the crime genre version of a Bosch painting and names the character after Bosch in order to help him do it, to have all of these characters in a paracosm of crime. And it's really interesting. Also, he was a crime reporter before succeeding with fiction, and it was observing real-life detectives while reading other writers in the crime genre that led him to finding what he called the missing ingredient that helped him bring his own stories to life, because he was writing and it was never quite there. But as if I remember him saying in an interview, it was literally seeing a detective put the arm of his glasses into his mouth while crouching over a victim's body that he found what he needed to make his fiction leap from the page. Now, how is that not training? How is that not somehow allowing yourself to interact with the world, be prompted by it, and then produce something unique and novel? Now, Connolly also trained my own brain. I read so many of his books as I was getting ready to write Flyboy, my first memory detective novel. And there's a lot of influence from this. And also it's carried on in Vitamin X, the sequel, which will be available sometime soon. But it wasn't just that I, quote unquote, trained on Michael Connolly. I wanted to bring some gravitas to what I was doing. So I read about half of Shakespeare's plays. And, I'd read a lot of them before, but I deliberately took a deep dive again into Shakespeare. I'd studied him at the graduate level in university, but I wanted to refresh my mind. But I was reading with a different lens. I was training myself to see what I could get in terms of gravitas to really make my memory detective project pop. Why? Because I want people to actually enjoy the memory training that I put into it. So it's not a gimmick, it's not a shtick, but it really has dimensionality. And what do you find in Shakespeare? Well, some people call it the two-world syndrome, and I worked on how can I do this. There's lots I could say about Shakespeare. There's a geometry in Shakespeare. In Othello, for example, it's a kind of psychomachia, which means a battle for the soul, where a devil is on one shoulder and an angel is on the other. And I really thought about how I could work that out. I also went and I reread the Oedipus Rex plays, all of them, but especially the first one, because those of you who know Vitamin X may know that there's a character with no eyes. Well, that's not coming out of nowhere. It's part of my training. Also, since it's about memory, I read George Perec's I Remember. I mean, who wouldn't? And I also read for the philosophy Choran's The Trouble with Being Born, if that's what it's called. Yeah, I also read Aristotle. I don't really recommend this translation. I think the Oxford Classics is a much better translation of the Poetics. But anyway, I read this version, and it's good for the sake of comparison. I also read this book on infinity. So there's just a lot of training that I put my brain through. And I think that we get confused with all of this AI and so forth. Oh, it trained on all of humanity. Well, so what? Humans have been training on as much literature as we possibly can for a long time. Frank Kermode wrote a book, I don't have it anymore, but it's called The Classic, I think. And it's all about how there's a canon of texts. Harold Bloom was all about this. I mean, he just was very, very good at channeling what is the DNA, so to speak, of literature. He wrote a really interesting book, Bloom did. I think it's called The Anxiety of Influence, about how people need to really overcome how freaked out they are about being inspired and influenced by others. And some people even need to symbolically kill their fathers. There's a really great Ezra Pound poem where he symbolically has this little battle with Whitman, I think it was. And it's just like great. And it's an example of this anxiety of influence and a poet working it out. I think a lot of us need to do that with the AI, because one way to think about, and I'm speaking specifically about GPT generators of text, is that we will feel anxiety about it. It has in a way, superseded our ability to go fast. But fast is not the premium here. It's the depth of the encoding. It's the depth of our own training. And so we want to think about it in terms of how we can slow it down in a way in order to get more out of it and maybe even keep pace with it. So some people have said, and I think it's a compelling idea, that really what these GPTs have done is they've made the MP3 version of the internet. So, an MP3 really takes a FLAC file or something large, a WAV file, and compresses it down. In the compression process, it adds artifacts, and those might be the hallucinations and so forth. But isn't that really what I do when I read all this Michael Connelly, and then I read Shakespeare, and I take all kinds of influence from Oedipus Rex, and essentially, in a way, what Vitamin X is it's an attempt, along with Flyboy, it's an attempt to put memory training into a kind of Lewis Carroll meets The Matrix, meets Michael Connelly novels, meets Gödel Escher Bach, and it is also an attempt to have the Hemingway paradox that Sir Roger Penrose talks about with orchestrated objective reduction. And it's essentially the MP3 version of that. I just compress it all down, new artifacts enter it, and it's new, but also at the same time, it is Groundhog Day. And it literally is trying to be Groundhog Day, but with a Hemingway paradox twist. Now, when it comes to the laws that govern reality, and I think plot is one of the laws that governs reality in a way, and rules and compression. I don't want to be pushy, but I think you really, really need to check out the Xenotext. The Xenotext Book 1, which is this red one, and the Xenotext 2, which is the blue one, by Christian Book. So Andrew Maine, Michael Connelly, they're both polymathic, and so is Christian Book. But when it comes to developing multiple skills and teaching yourself how to operate substantially in a variety of domains, Book is a man who composed a poem and encoded it into a deathless bacterium called Deinococcus radiodurans. This is something that's capable of surviving massive doses of radiation and possibly even surviving the death of the sun. And what these books are about is the insertion of poetry into this living material, this deathless bacterium. And it is the poetry itself. And it's poetry about the process and a variety of poems. But this is a beautiful artifact of human creativity attempting to survive and potentially just stay around forever. This is not science fiction. And as those of you who follow the Magnetic Memory Method project know, I'm a fanatic of all things recall. But in my view, the Xenotext project is the most literal act of intellectual preservation through a kind of memory possible. Now, it's not memory exactly, but what fascinates me is not just the project itself, the idea of putting poetry into physical material, but how that took a long time to do. Painstaking work over years and years, combining computers with human expertise from a variety of fields, having to learn molecular biology, collaborating with all these geneticists, and literally chiseling the poems that wound up in the deathless bacterium out of this massive amount of possible combinations until the words could actually be encoded so that they could live as both art and organism at the same time. And it's an act that fuses this ancient ambition, the quest for immortality, with modern science and actually pulls it off. So, when people say cute things like, well, when robots make music or when robots make art, no one can, I point them to the Xenotext because it shows what true interdisciplinarity looks like and how that it's not one or the other. It's about using the latest tools to interact with the most ancient project in the world. And it's an ancient project we're all intimately involved in. We have death anxiety. We want to stick around forever. So I think in many ways, Christian Book is just continuing, and I don't mean just in a way that diminishes the work, but he's continuing the work of Homer and many other writers, poets, musical composers by putting poetry in a form that will get remembered and passed on. So this is not about speed. It's about cultivating the patience to make thought incarnate and even microscopic, but because of the way that he made it microscopic and forced it into the smallest possible form that I've ever seen, the pressure of the constraint, the laws, the rules, make the ideas at the core of the Xenotext feel like the size of the universe itself. And that is sublime. All of this brings me to a fourth essential book I hope that you will read, AI Engineering by Chip Huon. And as you can tell by the title, this one is squarely about AI, but the others are very, very important because they'll help you think about AI. I would just suggest in this book, if nothing else that you read the chapter on prompt engineering. It will help you get a better understanding of what's really going on, and there's a massive warning that I'm not going to give you. And quite frankly, I think it's often better if you can suggest where to look, but not what to see. But I think you'll educate yourself so much better if you read this book, if you read no other book about AI, because I think a lot of people are getting freaked out about something they don't quite understand, and I don't think that that book is going to get dated anytime soon. And even if it is, you'll still get a better sense of Andrew Maine's point in the Weird Things podcast episode I recommended earlier, which is that so much of what you do and how you think about what you do around AI, it depends on the clarity of the human who asks the AI to perform and the questions that you ask. So this is a very, very good clarifying book. It's very accessible in terms of what it actually means to work with prompts and the ideas of fine-tuning and so forth, so that you're just not lost in what's going on. And it's also, chosen this owl for a particular reason that's quite interesting once you get into it. And that's part of the point. We can still continue to use nature, the physical world, in order to help us create mental models and metaphors that will help us better understand what's going on. And so this is probably always going to be true. It's not one or the other. It's not like we're all going to be sucked into computers and no longer have freedom or anything. In fact, we have a chance to have more freedom than ever before, but there may be discomfort because part of where freedom comes from is accepting limitations, exploring rules, and really allowing ourselves to be constrained because constraints are productive of more. A little bit more on that point in a second. But you've got to make sure that you put in the work to know what's going on rather than just reacting to what other people say is going on. Now, although I would not say I'm all in on AI, because as I mentioned, AI can mean a lot of different things, I am doing a lot of experimental research myself with chatbots for educational purposes. And my most successful so far is called GQ, which stands for Guided Questions. And speaking of constraints, I built it as best as I could to literally follow the constraints that constrain you to go through a questioning process that will help you find the main points in what you're reading. You see, I get asked a lot by people who get the Magnetic Memory Method Masterclass, how do I find the main points in books so that I know what's worth memorizing? And it's a real struggle. And so I have a process that I follow, and I learned it a long time ago, and it's a questioning process. So I baked it all into this GQ to help others go through that process themselves. Rather than having to memorize the various interrogation models that I use, you can actually be walked through it, but not fed the answers, but learn to develop your own questioning process and then determine what is demonstrably true about what you've read, so that when you consider, this is a main point and this isn't, you're much more likely to land on an accurate foundation. So GQ asks you questions that lead you through a metacognitive process based on a variety of thinking types and models, many from ancient traditions of the kind that helped our ancestors compose epic music, accurately explore parts of the cosmos long before telescopes existed, and enjoy some of the best newer ideas as you go through GQ in order to avoid the traps of all kinds of cognitive biases. And there's another influence that I baked into GQ. His name is Leonardo da Vinci. He was arguably a great questioner and probably the first modern mind to fuse art, science, politics even, into one continuous project along with theater and music and all kinds of things. He kept notebooks filled with sketches, anatomical diagrams, jokes, mirror-written ideas, and probably writing those ideas exercised his brain just to deal with having to read in that manner. But he also knew something that we often ignore, and that is that ideas don't thrive in isolation. They're not in one book. They're not even just in books at all. They're in conversation. Da Vinci actively talked with other experts, and he also understood his times. He understood the ecology of opportunity that was taking place around him. To build and experiment freely, he needed the resources of the people who controlled the resources. And that need for resources is still true to this day. If you want to protect your learning goals, it doesn't matter whether you're using AI or not. You need to engage the systems of power that shape how information flows. And quite frankly, that could be everything from government policy to platform algorithms, institutional cultures. And Da Vinci's genius in his time wasn't just in his inventions. It was in his navigation of the context. We can learn a lot from that because a lot of people say, oh, polymathy, it's about curiosity. No. Curiosity, well, it's certainly not enough on its own. It has to be coupled with strategy, has to be coupled with thinking. And one of the best explorations of this mindset is The Polymath by Waqas Ahmed. And Ahmed in this book traces how the Renaissance ideal of the well-rounded thinker really wasn't about mastering multiple fields. It's about incorporating them and integrating them into a worldview that allows you to either collaborate with existing platforms or somehow found your own platform. And I'm going to talk in the future on this channel about the idea of platform. So if you're not already subscribed, get subscribed so you don't miss a thing, hit notifications, etc. You know, if I were to draw a line between all of the people that we discussed today and not only my GQ, but of all the thinking models that I programmed into it, I feel like the connecting line that just runs through it all is that these people and these mental processes, they have participated in the building or the interaction with platforms. And that means accomplishing more than just short-term dopamine spikes. It means more than being a multi-potentialite who has a bunch of shallow experiences in this, that, and the other thing. These people that just really go deep, they seem to operate for the sake of establishing and maintaining the experience of wholeness. Now, this might seem a bit controversial, especially since so many people like to point out that Da Vinci dropped many of his projects. How could he possibly want wholeness when so many things he started were left unfinished? I myself have remarked upon that in Da Vinci's career. But when I last talked with Christian Book for an interview I'll release as soon as possible, he said that creating something beautiful was one of the key aspects at the core of what went into crafting the Xenotext. And Da Vinci clearly had beauty in mind as well, both in his art, but also in some of his personal relationships. There was something like an attempt at making the relationships themselves a kind of art. Even his meditations on water and the relationship between the behavior of human blood and water lend itself to an investigation of wholeness. How do the parts relate? And I think this is what Andrew Maine is getting at when he says that long conversations with AI about memory not only make him want to discuss it more with other humans, but it's also just a picture of hope where we're going to connect more and more and more. And Michael Connolly, yes, he's some kind of writing machine. And it often, I just think, how does he do this? So many books. He's a series producing machine too, with Amazon Prime specials. There's a series for Bosch. There's Bosch Legacy. There's a series for The Lincoln Lawyer. There's another one for René Ballard, which is a spin-off series. And he's just very good at making books that are then turned into film adaptations or series based on this whole picture of the world as he sees it, as if it was a painting from Bosch, literally inspired by that. It's referentiality, intertextuality, and programming the mind based on what's already there in order to interact with the new on the basis of a platform. For myself, the message you're listening to now, this video started on paper in the form of a scattered semi-mind map, and it's got multiple colors. And then I took this and I sat on the balcony and I did a pajama rough recorded version on my phone. I even wrote a theme song for this video that I decided not to torture you with, at least not yet. But the point is that I got physical. I got out of my mind and I've just had a blast, right? But not to divide myself from the machines and worry about Skynet. Human itself is an artificial concept, cooked up largely during the Enlightenment by the same people who gave you private prisons and schools that train you to not question the system, but to obey. So whatever you are and however you conceive of yourself, in order to thrive, you really must cultivate multiple ways of knowing. And it's visual, verbal, kinesthetic, emotional, philosophical, conceptual, directly material, conceptually synthetic, spiritually astute, and as bizarrely Zen as you can make it, because the future is unlikely to reward the person who knows the most or who can have a series of agentic AIs just producing a bunch of stuff, right? It's going to reward those of us who can synthesize the most, just like it did in the Renaissance, just like it did in the medieval era, just like it did all over the world throughout time. Perhaps also, in the words of Weird Al, it's going to reward those of us who can dare to be a little bit stupid. So, how can you start to synthesize rather than divide? Well, see if you can't set up a system or a couple of systems where you constantly move yourself between abstraction and physical embodiment. There's something very abstract about working with AIs, but then take yourself off of the AI and work with some of the traditional tools, like notebooks, like mind mapping, or even take notes while you're using the AI, and then between pixels and paper, you're going to find that your brain will process a lot more. And it's going to help you see and experience the mechanics of our metaphors, and you may want to make your own metaphors along the way. And take Da Vinci again. Each sketch is like an experiment, but also an act of memory. Da Vinci wasn't hoarding data. He was exploring the nature of understanding, which reminds me of another inspiration of mine, someone whose works have barely survived, save for a few fragments. Fans of memory techniques will recognize the name instantly, but they might not have heard some of the lesser-known tales of Simonides of Chios. This was the ancient poet credited with inventing, so to speak, the memory palace technique. I think the memory palace technique is much, much older than Simonides of Chios, but it's an interesting story and you should look it up if you haven't heard it. But here's what's interesting about Simonides of Chios. He was also known to carve epitaphs in stone. And once, on the way to catch a ship for a long oceanic journey where he would work on writing epic poems in praise of the finest achievers of his time, he came across a dead body lying on the beach. And I guess back then you didn't play Sherlock Holmes and try to find out why this poor fellow died. So Simonides gave the dead body a proper burial and carved an epitaph, which is really quite interesting. He says, "I pray those who killed me get the same themselves, O Zeus, of guest and host. I pray those who put me in the ground enjoy the profit of life." Now, it's interesting that Simonides encodes into the mouth of the dead man the prayer, and he encodes it into stone at the same time. Now think about that last part of the line. Enjoy the profit of life. Isn't that interesting? Simonides encoding his wish for a reward by essentially programming it into stone. How different is that really from Christian book? Encoding the wish that something about human creation will survive the heat death of the sun by putting it into a deathless bacterium, Deinococcus radiodurans. Isn't there a relationship there? Now, later that night in the story, the ghost of the dead man appears to Simonides in a dream. Don't get on that ship, the ghost tells Simonides. And Simonides wakes up, warns his fellow travelers the next morning, but of course they won't listen. They get on the boat, and Simonides obeys the dream. And of course, the ship sinks, killing everyone. So Simonides then returns to the epitaph that he, quote-unquote, programmed a prayer into by assuming the voice of the dead man, and he added, this is Simonides' savior, who, even though dead, has bestowed on the living a grace. Now, maybe the relationship here is a bit abstract, and I'm going to leave it to you to work out for yourself what it means to you. But for me, it reminds me of why we still need physical notes. What Tony Buzan called the radiant thinking produced by mind maps, and the other wonderful projects that we've discussed today. They all use laws and rules and constraints to produce multiple thoughts that would not be possible if the laws placed upon them weren't quite tight, whether it's the laws of plot or the laws of biology or the laws of using an AI. AI can process data, but only we humans, at least for now, can commemorate meaning in the way that Simonides commemorated meaning, but with so many implications. If you think about the first epitaph, and then when he came back and added more to it, it's wonderful to consider what it all means and just how deep the rabbit hole goes. So yes, use AI, use it relentlessly, use it intelligently, use it creatively, but never let it replace the part of you that marks the world, that puts your wishes into stone. That's where memory lives. Not in my head and not in yours, but in the interaction between our minds and the words that flow between them that make what you leave behind the Savior that Simonides imagined was the grace bestowed upon him by a dream. And that's where learning becomes legacy. And if we make a mistake and wipe ourselves out, well, you might want to read some Spinoza to find peace with that possibility. We'll have to save a discussion about Spinoza's relationship to memory and information for another day. He ground glass lenses for spectacles, and I'm guessing you probably didn't know that Spinoza wrote a study guide to go along with this gloriously, unbelievably profound ethics. I've been working on a new translation of Spinoza's How to Study Guide for you to go along with my Reborn series that so far includes Phoenix Reborn, my adaptation of The Great Phoenix by Peter of Ravenna, and then Rules Reborn, a reimagining of a work by Jacobus Publicius. These are labors of my love for learning, my inscription in stone for one and all, to realize my dream of memory and memory techniques surviving the heat death of the sun, or at least the heat death of forgetting, because it's pretty terrible to forget. This is a project that I mind mapped with Tony Buzan at my side back in 2015, 10 years ago, as I'm recording this, during what was a very exciting and uncertain time of the internet. It was a time when Tony Buzan was so excited by the possibilities of Twitter, how it forced you back then to express your ideas in so few characters. He found that explosive, this pressure that helped him make sure that every thought he put out was diamond hard because he accepted the constraint. like mind mapping, forces you to put pressure on your thoughts by sticking to the confines of a single page, or Christian Book's glorious poem, and how it required careful etching from the rules that govern living matter itself in order for poetry to carry on in outer space. If you want to rebuild your learning system from the ground up, read these people: Andrew Maine, Michael Connolly, Christian Book, Spinoza, Waqas Ahmed, all these people. And if you'd like more help realigning yourself for the AI age, go through the focusing lens and the constraining pressure of my free self-education blueprint. If you've already gone through it, revisit it again, because the way that you'll think about it after going through what we've talked about today and the inspiration all these epic authors I've just mentioned provides, it will change everything that you think about it. And if you want to access GQ, my guided questioning AI, make sure that you are subscribed, and getting the self-education blueprint is a way to do it, because I only make GQ available once in a while. You can get the self-education blueprint at magneticmarymethod.com/SEB for self-education blueprint. And then come back and stick with me to watch my video, Sharpen Your Mind Like Lincoln Sharpened His Axe, for even more thinking types that can help you keep moving forward, because that's the real task. Not to compete with machines or divide yourself from machines, but to forge a mind that no one or no thing can imitate. And let me leave you with this from Spinoza, who says, "From this we clearly understand why the mind from the thought of one thing immediately passes to the thought of another, which has no likeness to the first." That's the point. You are like other minds, but your originality and your creativity need not have likeness to others. The pen, the book, your memory, and the ability to question these things using specific thinking tools remain the ultimate technologies to keep your mind like no other. Use them well, and they will keep your mind and your memory magnetic.